Today on CityCast Boise. Inside Idaho's women's prisons, survivors say they endured years of sexual abuse from staff. But when they sought help, complaints disappeared, investigations went nowhere, and retaliation became routine. We're looking at how this culture of abuse and cover-up was allowed to thrive and what it would take to change it. And a quick content warning. In this episode, we discuss sexual abuse cases that listeners may find disturbing. It's Thursday, October 16th. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Joining me to break it all down is Whitney Bryan, a journalist with Investigate West. Thanks so much for being here, Whitney.
Thanks for having me.
You spent a year investigating sexual abuse and cover-ups inside Idaho's women's prisons. What first led you to this story, and how did you realize the problem was so widespread?
Well, as I think the best journalism usually does, this started with a tip from a woman who was experiencing this herself. She had filed some reports against prison guards and other prison staff who had sexually abused her during her time behind bars in Idaho prisons. And once I learned about her personal story, she was adamant that this was not a unique situation. This was happening to other women. She was talking to other women who this had happened to, and she started connecting me with those other victims who connected me with others and more and more and more. It just sort of continued the ball rolling like that. And as we talked to each new victim, we just discovered, different pieces of this story and sort of unfolded organically like that.
And for people who haven't had a chance to read the series yet, how would you describe what's happening inside these prisons and how it's being allowed to continue?
Right. So I think it's really important to explain sort of at the top of this that sexual abuse in prisons is a unique situation because when you're talking about, in this case, guards and other prison staff abusing women who are behind bars, you have to remember that these women are, first of all, wards of the state. They're in state custody. And secondly, that these guards, these mostly men we found who are abusing these women, they have essentially complete control over these women's lives while they're in prison. They control their meals. They control visitation. They control whether these women have access to commissary. They control these women's safety and housing restrictions, really almost every aspect of their life. So it's really important to remember as we're talking about this that there's a really unusual power dynamic here that I think most people probably haven't experienced in their lives. And what we found was that within these prisons, because of that control, when a woman is abused by one of these guards or another prison staff, there's very little that they feel they can do about it. If they report it, they feel they're going to be retaliated against by the same staff that they're accusing or by the coworkers of those staff members. All those things I just mentioned, prohibitions on commissary, visitation, meals, living situation can happen if the staff don't like what they're hearing. The other piece of it is the system as a whole. So we're talking about the Idaho prison system as a whole. The folks whose job it is to really investigate these when they are reported and when a woman is believed, they wouldn't know that these things are happening or even that they were reported unless someone in the prison where the woman is being abused and where the report occurred tells them about it. So again, these are often supervisors or coworkers of the accused person who would then have to call up, headquarters, prison system headquarters and say, we need you to come in and investigate one of our own. And so for obvious reasons, that doesn't happen as often as it should.
So it really sounds like these women are in a very unique situation where you have to get somebody in the system who is working for the system to believe you and then also forward that message to someone who can investigate. That it's, I don't know, just from my perspective, it doesn't seem like there would be very many times that would be successfully taken seriously.
Absolutely. That is correct. And that is what we have found is that it's often not taken seriously when a woman does feel safe enough, or sometimes not safe enough, but just brave enough to speak out in these situations. So, as you said, these women, because they are in prison, they can't call police and report a sexual assault in the same way that you or I could, someone outside of the walls of a prison. I can call 911, I could walk into a police station and I could file a report, and then law enforcement would investigate from that point. 911 is not an option in the prison on the phones. And I have talked to a few women who said they eventually did attempt to call like a police dispatch line, for instance, to try to report their abuse. And what they found was that the police dispatch lines cut them off, because when you call from a prison, you get that announcement at the beginning of the call, right, that says this call is coming from an inmate at whatever correctional facility. And when that hits a dispatch line, the dispatch cuts off the call. So they literally don't have access to report this to police, which means when they're reporting it to, again, a coworker, a supervisor, someone who works in the same space with their abuser or their alleged abuser. And then from there, it has to be reported up the chain to sort of the higher ups in the prison system. And then those people higher up in the prison system are responsible for sending it to law enforcement. So that does not happen, as you suggested, very often. And we found that even when that does happen, even when it does start to work its way up the chain, those reports are often not taken seriously.
Idaho has adopted state and federal policies meant to prevent and investigate sexual abuse for people in custody. That these laws on paper seem like they should protect people. But your reporting found that since 2020, there have been at least 59 documented allegations of Idaho prison staff sexually abusing imprisoned women. And few of these cases were ever investigated, let alone prosecuted. What did you find about how these systems function in reality for these women?
There are a lot of policies in place. First of all, on the federal side, so those policies are called PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act. It was passed in 2003, obviously nationwide. Idaho was one of the last states to adopt PREA and its guidelines, which are meant to prevent exactly this kind of thing, and also are meant to help once it does happen. Of course, you're going to have a bad apple every once in a while. So there are also rules around how it should be handled when it's reported, how it should be investigated, all of those things. Idaho adopted this in 2015. It was one of the last states to do so. And since 2015, the state has adopted its own policies that essentially mimic this federal policy. Things like when it's reported, it should be handled by an investigator who is not the person being accused, for instance. Sometimes the PREA investigator in a prison can also be accused of this type of thing. So it's a lot of rules around ensuring that these are investigated and handled as safely as possible, and also to prevent retaliation against, in this case, the women who are reporting this type of sexual abuse. But we found that these policies are not often being followed, they're not being enforced. And I found also that IDOC, Department of Correction leaders in Idaho, they really have no way of knowing when policies are failing to be followed within these facilities. And so there's really very little oversight to ensure that these things are happening the way that they're supposed to.
Now, Whitney, in your reporting, you also mentioned that there are supposed to be audits of this process and these investigations, and Idaho keeps passing. Can you, how do we keep having these allegations that aren't being investigated, but it seems like Idaho's getting a good score, or at least passing these audits?
That was a question that we had while we were reporting very early on. This was a question that came up for me. So I mentioned the federal standards, PREA for short. And so there are, as part of those requirements, there are audits that are required to be done by someone who is certified through the federal PREA Resource Center to go into prisons. They have to do it at least every 3 years. Every prison has to bring in an auditor who then they do many things. The audit reports are, sometimes over 120 pages. But one of the things that these auditors do is they look at the reports of sexual abuse violations against staff members and also against inmates. And they analyze, okay, how many of these were, sent to law enforcement? How many of these were investigated by the prison system itself? And what were the outcomes? And what we found is that those reports that have come out of the women's prisons in Idaho were just wrong. They don't at all match what the prison system is telling us in terms of what they have had reported and what the outcomes of those reports were. So there are big discrepancies there. Even within the own audit reports, there are discrepancies. For instance, in one of the prisons, we found that in the audit report, they jotted down that, there were, I think it was 4 reports against staff members in the year timeframe that they looked at. And of those 4 reports, none of them were criminally investigated. But the standards say any possible criminal act has to be investigated by law enforcement. So they've made a note in this audit that didn't happen. And yet they passed the prison saying they are completely compliant and in line with all of the standards. So even within these audits, there are discrepancies that we found. And we tried very hard to reach out to some of these auditors to explain that. We asked the Department of Correction about that, and nobody had an answer for us.
Something else that I thought was incredibly shocking. I like to pride myself on being aware of Idaho's laws and kind of being in the know with Idaho code. But something I didn't realize was that Idaho has very specific laws for what constitutes sexual abuse in prisons, and that it needs to involve genital contact. But a lot of these women were experiencing harassment and abuse that didn't involve genital contact, but was still obviously deeply traumatic. Why does Idaho fail to cover those violations? Like, why is what is constituted sexual abuse so narrow?
I believe every state in the country at this point has some sort of law that is intended to protect specifically inmates from staff who work at prisons where they're incarcerated, just for the reasons I explained earlier about that really uneven power dynamic. But every state law is different. And so in Idaho, as you said, our state law requires that essentially someone's genitals are involved. So when I say that, what I mean is one woman I spoke to, she claims that her breasts were fondled by a staff member in a closet. It was against her will. She did not agree to this, but that would not fall under Idaho's law that protects inmates from sexual abuse because her breasts are not considered genitals. They're not considered off limits under this felony law that we have. Now, what I will say that's, I think, really important to note is that it is still illegal in Idaho for anyone inside a prison or not to touch someone else sexually without their permission, without their consent, right? So if what I just described were to happen, to someone on the street, let's say in a department store, closet or something, that would be illegal because it's happening without that woman's consent. The same applies here in the prison situation. The difference is that what I found is public defenders are winning a lot of these cases for the men who are accused of this because prosecutors are not charging these cases. So if it doesn't meet the threshold of the felony, someone's genitals being involved, then prosecutors are often dismissing these cases and never charging the man who, in this case, fondled a woman's breasts, because they would have to prove that the woman did not consent to that. And what I'm hearing from prosecutors and from people who work in these prisons is nobody believes a criminal. So they're never going to win that case. That's what they're telling me, because juries and judges are going to say, she's lying. They're not going to believe that it was not consensual. And so for that reason, it's just not even being charged.
Hi, I'm Michael Ziviak, Chief Revenue Officer of CityCast. Why do most of us want to learn a new language? It's because we want to speak it out in the real world with real people. Babbel gets you there fast. My daughter's a senior in high school, and after she graduates, we're taking a father-daughter trip to Spain. I know, she's spoiled, but that's on me. I'll be honest, my Spanish right now is pretty much tops out at ¿Dónde está la biblioteca? But when we get there, I want to actually talk to people, order food, and really connect with the locals, not just stumble through the basics. That's why I'm starting with Babbel. Learning a language with Babbel is all about small steps, big wins, and progress you can actually track and feel. And with how busy things get here at CityCast, I love that Babbel's bite-sized, 10-minute lessons fit perfectly into my day, whether it's between meetings or while I'm having coffee in the morning. I'm really excited to start picking up real-world Spanish before our trip so we can experience Spain in a more meaningful way. Right now, Babbel has a special deal for our listeners. Get up to 55% off your subscription at babbel.com/citycast. That's BABBEL.com/citycast for up to 55% off. Rules and restrictions may apply. Gracias and adios.
One of the most disturbing patterns in this series of reporting is how the allegations of abuse were repeatedly ignored or mishandled by the Idaho Department of Corrections or state police or other authorities. And like you just mentioned, on top of all of that, people don't believe these women solely because they've been incarcerated. I mean, let's be honest, our society doesn't really believe women anyway, but then if you add that incarcerated element, it just compounds it. How does this prison culture or this chain of command, on top of the disbelief of incarcerated women, allow these cover-ups to keep happening or allow this pattern to continue?
Well, I would say there are a few things. One is, I've already mentioned this, but I think it's a really key point to what we found. And that is that there's very little oversight inside the prison walls for ensuring that these types of reports are being handled correctly, and that when there is evidence that something like this has occurred, that the proper, consequences are being handed down to the guards who are being accused, as well as ensuring prevention of retaliation against the woman who was the victim in these cases. So in other words, there's really no one coming into the prisons to check and make sure that the prison staff are doing what they're supposed to do, following the policies. There is also a PREA coordinator. Again, that's the Prison Rape Elimination Act coordinator, so an employee who works for the Department of Correction here in Idaho, whose job is to essentially oversee this process, oversee these reports system-wide, so at all prisons across the state. That person who held that position actually retired recently, so there's currently no one doing that work in Idaho. So that oversight is also lost for the moment anyways. And even when that person was in her position, she was not going into the prisons. So again, you just have this big disconnect between the prisons where these things are occurring, where they're being reported, and where they're being, handled, or in some cases we're hearing swept under the rug. And there's no one coming in to ensure that that's not happening. So it's pretty easy to get away with. The other thing I would say we're hearing from women who have either been victims or who have been witness to some of these situations, and from former Department of Correction employees that we spoke to, is the mentality of sort of, that thin blue line that we often hear about law enforcement, covering for each other, having each other's backs. Certainly that can be understandable to a point, right? When you're working in a prison, especially in a security position like that. However, we're hearing that bleeds through the entire process. Once these things are reported, they're less likely to be believed because the person who's investigating and seeing these reports is a staff member as well, far more likely to believe their colleague or, their subordinate employee over a criminal, as these women are often referred to.
Now, something else, I feel like I'm a broken record here saying this was disturbing and this was disturbing, but truly, this was some of the most shocking things I've ever read. That even when there were cases where the victim was believed and there was an investigation, these people were being charged with things like burglary, not rape, not sexual assault, but burglary. How? How can that possibly be what's happening?
Another great question that I had a very similar reaction when I saw the first case of that. So what's often happening is in the few cases that we found over the last 10 years, we looked at every single case where a prison staff member was charged with, the law in Idaho is called sexual abuse with a prisoner. That's the felony that we talked about earlier. So we looked at every single one of those cases. And what we found is that the vast majority of the people charged with that were given a plea deal of some sort. These folks were initially charged with a sexual contact with a prisoner, which is a felony rape charge in the state of Idaho. But many of them received lesser sentences, lesser charges in the end, because prosecutors offered them those things in exchange for a guilty plea, rather than prosecuting the case to the fullest. I spoke to a couple of prosecutors who said to me, well, part of that is because, the victims are not very believable. They're not very sympathetic to a potential jury or to a judge. And so we didn't feel like we could necessarily win that case, or we didn't feel like we should charge them to the full extent because of what we were hearing from the victim. And so in some cases, they offered the charge of burglary as a plea deal. So the charge of burglary is also a felony, but it's a non-violent felony. It doesn't fall under the rape statute. And the definition is, something like entering a building or a facility with the intent to commit a crime. So it's very, very vague. In other words, they're arguing in those cases that the person who was initially charged with rape and who is accused of sexually assaulting one of these women, they're saying that person entered the building, the prison in these cases, with the intent to sexually abuse this inmate. And so that's how they're rationalizing that lesser charge of burglary.
And Whitney, I'm guessing when they plead down to burglary, they probably don't have to register as sex offenders, right?
That's right. The original charge, the sexual contact with a prisoner felony, the rape felony, does come with a sexual offender registry requirement. So if someone's convicted of that by, say, a jury, they would have to register as a sex offender. But what we found was that every plea deal that was made for that charge, whether or not the plea deal included a different charge, so even people who did plea to that rape felony, only one of those people actually had to register as a sex offender. Everybody else had that removed from the requirements as part of their plea deal. So we found that in the last 10 years, there were only 3 men who were charged with sexually assaulting a female inmate in the women's prison where they worked. And of those 3 men, all 3 of them received plea deals. Only one of them is a registered sex offender. And that person is the only person who received a prison sentence of any kind as part of his plea deal. He actually ended up spending about 9 months, I think just shy of 10 months, in an alternative sentencing program that we have here in Idaho. It's called a rider. So you go into a prison facility, but you're separated from the general population. You go through programming. Again, it's an alternative sentence. And because he completed that alternative sentence, his prison sentence was actually removed, dismissed from his plea deal. So in other words, in a nutshell, that means none of the men who were charged and accepted plea deals for this crime served any time in prison for what they did.
From my perspective, I'm seeing a lot of hypocrisy here because a lot of the women who are incarcerated in Idaho are there for drug charges, which now I'm not going to say those are good or bad, but those are typically nonviolent offenses. And these women are serving prison sentences of several years or several months or, a significant amount of time. But then these guards who are committing felonies are very rarely spending time in prison, only one ever. The injustice of that just really grates on me. Like, how can that be how the system works?
Well, I will say that's the question that I'm hearing from a lot of the women that I've spoken to who have had this experience or who have witnessed this during their own time in prison. They are certainly frustrated that, as you said, they're spending many years in a lot of cases behind bars for, nonviolent drug offenses, maybe DUIs, driving under the influence, things like that. And yet their abusers are, one, often not being taken seriously at all. It typically doesn't even make it to that point to get to the courtroom for a charge and, a sentencing. But when it does, these women are saying, this isn't fair. This is not just this, this feels to them, as they've said to me, like they are being treated like pariahs in Idaho. They are, the quote unquote bad guys for being arrested for having drugs on them, whereas these men can do whatever they want to them while they're behind bars and nobody cares. I've heard that many times from dozens of women at this point.
So from the patterns you observed, what changes in law or policy would need to happen to make Idaho prisons safer for women? Is there a way to prevent this systemic cover-up and ensure that complaints are taken seriously?
I wish I had all the answers to how to fix this kind of problem. But what I can say is that there are several policies. We've talked already about policies that we currently have in place. So I think number one would just be increased oversight and ensuring accountability for those who are not following those policies properly, whether that is, Department of Correction, prison system leadership going into these facilities and somehow, auditing or evaluating the process, holding accountable people who are found to have not followed that process properly. In our reporting, we found that even some wardens at these prisons were signing off on reports of abuse like this that, a staff member had said, I don't believe them, and so we're just marking this as unsubstantiated or unfounded. And wardens are just signing off on that, and then it's over. So having another level of oversight, another level of accountability for when those things do happen would certainly be key to ensuring that there's a more fair and equitable process when a woman does report something like this against a staff member. There are also other states that we can look to when it comes to the problem of the law here in Idaho being very narrow. We talked about that felony law requiring that someone's genitals are involved in order to be charged. So in other states, there are specific laws to protect inmates from things like, fondling of the breasts, as I gave that example earlier, or other, sexual touching that is not currently covered under Idaho's inmate protection law. And the reason that's really important to be put in its own law and not just defaulting to, general sexual assault and sexual abuse laws is because, again, that power dynamic is at play. And so in many cases, we're hearing from women, well, when he asked me to do some sexual favor for him, or when he started to, reach under my shirt, whatever the case might be, I didn't say no because I didn't feel like I could. I didn't feel like I had the choice. I was afraid of what was going to happen to me if I did say no, if I did fight back. So it's really important to have these separate laws protecting inmates specifically from the guards who oversee them, because it is different when you're a female inmate and the perpetrator is a guard who has all that control over you. These women have nowhere to go. They don't feel like they can say no. And so you have that requirement in our law now where a prosecutor has to prove that this woman did not consent. And when she's not saying no, when she's not fighting back as strongly because she's afraid, they don't feel like they can win those cases, so they're not prosecuting them.
Whitney, what do you hope that readers take away from your investigation and reporting? What do you hope happens next?
First and foremost, my hope is that the women who trusted me, who trusted us with some of the most terrible things that have ever happened to them, feel like they are being heard, that they are being believed, and feel like they're being taken seriously. And, I think what that looks like for each of those women is going to be different, whether that's, someone seeing these articles and just believing them, that might be enough for some of these women. Whether it's maybe reopening a case that got closed, without a proper investigation. For some women, that's what they're going to want to see. Some women are not going to feel like they have received justice unless their perpetrator is charged and spends time in prison like they themselves have had to do for their own crimes. I think on a larger scale, personally, I would just like to see some more discussion about accountability and transparency within these issues. I think it's important that the Department of Correction, that lawmakers, that the governor's office, other agencies are getting involved in this discussion, are looking at this problem and talking about ways to address it, whether that be increased oversight, more transparency for the public. That's a big issue that we discovered as we were reporting this, that many of these reports are being, withheld and hidden from the public. So the public would never know when someone is being charged with burglary, as you suggested earlier, for raping an inmate. So I think that really my hope is that this will prompt discussion about how to improve the situation for women in Idaho prisons, how to handle these reports when they are made, and how to ensure that there's oversight of the people who are handling those reports.
Well, Whitney, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. There were times this series was a very harrowing read, so I can only imagine how difficult and challenging that could be, investigating it and speaking with these women personally. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come break it down and talk about it for my listeners.
Oh, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. And I know the women that I've been speaking with are just really glad that anyone is interested in hearing their story. It's really important to them, not just to be heard, but again, to be taken seriously. And I think it sounds like you and hopefully some of your readers are doing that. And I think that's, a big win for the work that I do, if nothing else comes of it.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. For a more in-depth look at this issue, check out the full series from Whitney Bryan and Investigate West called Guarded by Predators. We'll link it in our show notes. Catch you tomorrow.